In this video, I'm doing another Go code roast, this time of the project called logstash-exporter. Hi, I'm Jonathan Hall. A couple of weeks ago, I came across this post on Reddit by Kuskoman, who asked for a review of a project he'd written in Go. I asked in the comments if he would be interested in me doing it on my channel, and he agreed. So here we go. Let's have a look. So this project is called logstash-exporter. I'm not really familiar with what it does beyond the title. It's actually based on another project the author mentioned when I reached out to him. Credit where credit is due. Thanks to Bonner News' logstash-exporter that this project I'm about to review is actually based on. As always, I really like to start my Go project reviews with the go.mod file. So let's start there. The reason I like to start there is just to get a really high-level view of what the project imports, which sort of tells me a little bit about what to expect, what libraries, what frameworks to expect, and so on. So here we have only two direct dependencies, go.env, which is pretty straightforward, I guess, and the Prometheus Go client. So not really any external dependencies of real mention. Go.env just handles turning a .env file into environment variables. And then Prometheus, so it's reporting something somewhere, apparently. I have checked out this project on my local machine, so I'm going to do most of my review in my IDE. Of course, after checking the go.mod, I like to see what kind of test coverage we have. So let's see if there's any tests for this project. And we do have some tests. I suppose I should run with a cover flag to see how much coverage we have. Pretty good coverage. Most of the packages have 60. They all have 60% or more, except for the CMD exporter package, which has no test files, and the config, which are probably pretty simple. We'll look at those. Some of the packages have 80, 90%. So it looks like this was testing was taken seriously on this project. That's a good thing. Let's start with the main package, which is in the CMD exporter directory. And remember, this one didn't have any test coverage. That's probably because it's just a main function. But let's see what we have going on here. And indeed, it is just a main function. It is pretty straightforward. It initializes the environment, which is probably what calls go.env. Indeed, it calls go.env. That's all it does. And then it starts a server. Let's see what that server does. It's an HTTP server with the standard mux. All right, so let's start talking about what I like and don't like. The first thing I don't like that I've seen so far is this name helpers. I don't like that name for anything. All code exists to help, so it's not descriptive. Same problem with utils or tools. All code has utility or is a tool. That's the only reason code ever exists. So I don't like that name. I understand why people use that sort of name sometimes because they don't know where else to put things. But take the effort. Name your packages descriptively so that we know what they mean. Let's look at that while we're talking about it. Let's see what's in the helpers package. So we have an env helper and a Prometheus helper, and then a test for each one. Those should probably be called env and Prometheus and not be called helpers at all. There should be two separate packages, one for env and one for Prometheus, in my view. So that's my first complaint about this. Along those same lines, I would love to see GoDoc on the exported functions here. Now, an argument can be made that the GoDoc wouldn't really provide a whole lot, but I think that it would. Like initialize env is pretty straightforward, except it's not, right? It probably should tell us what it's doing. What does initialize env mean? Now, we know what it does by looking at the code, but you shouldn't have to look at the code, right? So I would add a GoDoc here. Simple enough. Now anybody reading the GoDoc can know what it actually does without having to guess. Why does this exist? It's returning it's calling a function with the same name and the same arguments and the same return types. The only difference is that it's has a capital E here, which arguably the standard library should use. Get env with the lowercase e is non-standard according to Go specifications or to Go standards. But this function probably shouldn't exist at all. Just use the standard one. And then you don't have to worry about the documentation because it's already taken care of for you in the standard library. You can see that one is well documented. So get rid of that function. Get required env, that's interesting. It's doing the same. It's calling getenv. It should call os.getenv instead. And then it's returning an error if the value is unspecified. That sounds reasonable to me, a reasonable thing to do. Yeah, I don't see a problem with that per se, except that it should be calling the standard version of getenv instead of proxying through this function that doesn't add any value. And getenv with the default value also does a reasonable thing. If it's the same as required env, except if it's not returned, then it returns the default value. Simple enough. I don't know how much these are used. These are pretty simple things to implement. If you use them a lot, then having them in a library like this makes sense, as long as the library is well named. Let's skip over the Prometheus stuff. I don't think that's too interesting yet. Maybe I'll get to it later. So let's look at this server, because I think that looks to be the heart of the application. Let's see what it does. First thing, of course, it sets up a Prometheus handler on the metrics endpoint. Simple / So all this HTTP server does is provide metrics. And then if you go to // it redirects you to metrics. Simple enough. And then it has a health check. So it looks like that's really all it does anyway. Not a whole lot to talk about there, I guess. What does the health check do? It just does a health check to the logstash URL. It's using a somewhat obsolete feature of the HTTP client, which is probably worth talking about. So while you definitely can still use this timeout, it's generally considered best practice these days to use a context, which is mentioned here. It's not that the timeout is literally deprecated, but it's not usually necessary anymore, and it's usually better practice to use a context because, for the reason that you can tie it to other things. In this case, that doesn't matter, but you can have a context that is not tied just to the duration of the request. It can be tied to other things. So something to consider. Oh, here's an actual problem. We're instantiating a new HTTP client for every request. Now, I don't know how often these health checks are done, but this should be done, at minimum, it should be done here. That way, you don't have to create a new HTTP client for every request that's made, which allows it to do some interesting caching and performance improvements. In particular, it can leave that connection open. Let's say that this health check happens every minute. It might leave that underlying HTTP connection open. It might. And do those health checks faster without having to do the TCP handshake on every request again. For a simple health check like this, it's unlikely to make a practical difference, but it's still good practice to use a single client many times rather than one client per request. So that's one thing I would definitely change here. I would probably also use a context rather than this. In fact, yes, definitely something to be used here. I would be using the context of the incoming request, which is not being done here. So let me show you how that should be done. Rather than using client.get, we should be creating a request. So this would be a big improvement as well. So what this does is it uses the request from the incoming HTTP request, the client that made the request to us, and it uses that same context in the outbound request to the logstash server. The reason this is beneficial is if that request is ever canceled for some reason, in a regular web browser situation, that could be that the person hits the stop button, for example, then we can propagate that cancellation all the way down. Without doing this, if that incoming request is canceled, we will continue to wait for that other server to respond, even if it takes 20 minutes or whatever. Meanwhile, consuming open file handles and network resources and memory and whatever that can never be used because the client that was listening for a response went away. So this will propagate that cancellation. This also serves as a great way to demonstrate how to tie the timeout I was talking about earlier into that same context. So the way we would do that is this. Assign the context from the inbound request to the new CTX variable. So now we're tying that timeout to the same context that we had coming in from the request. So now this context that we passed to the new request will be canceled in either case that we hit the 2-second timeout or the incoming request is canceled. So this is a more robust, more performant, actually in a micro performance way, version of the same function. So those are a couple changes I would make here. So I think one of the more interesting parts of this application probably is the new collector manager, because this is, I haven't looked at it yet, but I'm guessing that this is where a lot of the logic is happening. So let's have a look there. Instantiate a logstash client. Once again, I would like to see GoDoc on the exported types and functions to explain what they do. I'm sure it's obvious to the author of this code, and if he's intending to use it more personally, that's fine. But I think if you want other people to use this code, if you're on or you're doing this internally on a project with other colleagues, having GoDoc is a great onboarding tool. It would make it easier for me to consume this code if I had explanations what a collector is, what a collector manager is, and how the new collector manager works. For example, you can be surprised sometimes how just a single sentence can clarify something drastically for somebody who's new to your code, who doesn't have the same context you do. Okay, there's a nitpicky problem. This log import should be at the top. Generally, you keep your standard library imports in one group at the top, and then your own imports at the bottom. I'm sure that was just a mistake. I'm sure that wasn't intentional. So it's not really a criticism of the author, whoever wrote this file, but it's something that can be improved slightly. The other common example is that that whatever calls this function does the same pattern, and maybe whatever calls it does the same pattern, and whatever calls it does the same pattern, and then you end up with duplicate logs. Now, maybe some of those logs have additional context in them, or different error messages or something like that, but that's still very difficult to read. It's hard to tell where the error originated by reading the logs, and it's really hard to get the context. You really have to piece everything together as a forensics puzzle to figure out what actually happened. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but that's something that there's many better ways to handle that. The general rule is handle every error once and only once, and logging counts as handling. So the solution is to delete that line. Now that I've said that, if there is no way to have Prometheus do something useful with that error, if it doesn't log it on its own, then maybe you're stuck here and you have to do that. And that does happen in some cases when you're working with libraries that don't have great error handling. I don't actually know how Prometheus handles an error coming from the collect function, so I don't know if that applies here. If this were my code and I knew that did apply here, I would definitely leave a comment explaining why I'm logging it here. Something to that effect. Let's keep going. Let's look at the config package, since that's one that didn't have any tests. Not that I expect to find anything very interesting here, but let's have a look. So here we're calling that the helpers get in with default that we looked at earlier. I'm not sure why we're doing that here, since the default is blank. It seems to me like that's exactly equivalent to just this, which is the equivalent to this. I would also strongly consider moving all those helpers functions into this package, since it seems that they're probably only used in this package. I'm not sure of that. Let me check. Let me just grep for one of those. Yeah, it's only used in config and in the helpers package. So just forget the helpers package. Just move that into your config package, and then you don't have to worry about the package name because it's already in the right place. Doesn't need to be exported anymore either. So that would be a nice, simple, elegant solution to that particular code smell, if you will. Okay, so that's not really config, it's a constant, but I guess putting it in the config package is okay. So it looks to me like, here's my guess. The helpers that we looked at were probably copied from another package that the author has used many times. Because we're not using all of the, or in fact, the only function of those that we seem to be using is this one. So the get-env that with the capital E isn't actually used, and the must or the get required env apparently isn't used either. Let's verify that. Yeah. So there's something to complain about. So if we come back over here to helpers, let's change this to. Let's delete this one. It's not used anywhere. Neither is this, except here, which should be os.getEnv. And now this method, this function, should actually be moved into the config package. In fact, so should this initialize one. Anyway, I'm not going to do that now, but I would just move both of these into the config package. Leave this one exported since it's needed to be called from the main function. This one doesn't need to be exported anymore at that point. You can clean up. Half of that file is gone now. It was never used in the first place. And the other half belongs somewhere else. And then this Prometheus helpers, if it still needs to exist, rename the package from helpers to Prometheus or prom helpers or something like that. More likely, find out where these functions are actually being used and move them there. So that one is being used nowhere. So this one can be deleted. Did I break something? Let me just verify here. Oh, I broke the tests because I deleted functions that they called. Let me finish cleaning that up. Required. And I broke this test. And I broke this test. I'll probably break a test by doing that, but I'm going to see what else I can delete from this. Is this used? That one is used, and it's used in a couple of different packages. So that does need to be in its own package. So that one's okay. How about this one? That one's also used. That one's also used. So there's only one of the 4 functions in this package that were not used. So not a real big deal there. Let's look at the fetchers here, logstash client, since that's probably part of the core of the application, and see what we have. So here we return a new logstash client. Presumably, the endpoint must be a URL. I'm imagining, and based on my memory. Oh, we're using some generics here. Fancy. All right, so another thing I notice here is that we're not using a context on these requests either. So same as I mentioned before, it would be good to use a context here from something. I don't know which context that needs to be yet, because I haven't looked all the way up the call stack. So let's examine that. But what I want is to change this to now this doesn't work because this HTTP client is apparently a custom interface that uses get only, and that's not a good idea. This should be do. I don't know why this is an interface. Probably so it can be mocked in tests. You should never need to mock that. So honestly, the better solution is just not to do that at all, and instead use the actual HTTP client like this. I'm sure this will break a bunch of tests. Let's verify. Yeah, mock client. There's no reason to mock that. No reason at all. That's just. Yeah, don't mock your HTTP. There's no reason to do that. Just use the real client. There's already test capabilities in the standard library to do that. I have a couple of videos about that for HTTP testing, both on the client and server. I'll have some cards up here or links in the description. Check those out. There's no reason to mock this. Don't do that. I'm going to undo all my changes here, though, so that the code doesn't break. But this is what I'm going for. And then I would want to pass in a context here, actually. And the question to be answered, which I'm going to revert these changes and then investigate. The question to be answered is, where should this context come from? How far up the call chain? So I'm going to revert these changes so that the code is whole again. And then I'm going to investigate where this is called from. It's called from queries. And so this needs a context. So basically, we should be passing a context in here, which in turn needs to get it from somewhere. Yeah, so this is the problem here. So this is where that is initially coming from. And there's no context here because it's Prometheus is handling that. I don't think Prometheus gives us an option to do that with a context. So the most we could possibly do with a context here, which isn't worth it, is use a global context. The only reason that would be valuable is it would allow quote-unquote graceful shutdown in case the application is stopped. Otherwise, we could add a timeout. In fact, we should add a timeout. So that's one thing we could do. We could pass a context in here. We could do this, and that would actually be a useful thing to do. Of course, you could put that timeout deep in the code, right where the call is being done. My preference, though, is to put that as high in the code as possible so that your internal code doesn't have to care about those details. In other words, the internal code, the code here, should just be able to trust that the context it gets has the right timeouts and so on, and then it just uses that context. But in any case, this client request should have a timeout on it. Probably should be short. So that's my real complaint there. This request needs to have a timeout on it, and also get rid of the HTTP client interface. There's no reason to be mocking that. That's silly. So I'm going to stop there. I've been talking at you for a while. I know I haven't looked at all the code in the project, and I certainly haven't built a comprehension around everything in the project. But I've found a few things that I do like and a few things that I don't like. That's enough, I think, for this video for now. If you would like me to review some of your code, leave a comment below. I'd love to see your project, and maybe I'll make a future video about yours. Every one of these I do with permission of the author. I'm not going to review your code without permission. I don't want to embarrass anybody. This time, big shout out to Kuskoman or Jakub, I don't know how to say the last name, Surdej. Thank you a lot for volunteering your project, for asking on Reddit, and volunteering your project for this video. I hope you've learned something. If you have, hit that like button and subscribe so you get other videos like this in the future. Also, I'm available for hire if you would like me to come work with you on your team. Maybe your team has recently switched to go from Java or C# and you need somebody to do this sort of review with you and help you know the best practices. I am available. Head over to boldlygo.tech. You can find me there. Or just leave a comment below. I'd love to hear from you and maybe review your public project on a future video. Until then, boldly go.